It was a day like any other in our peaceful neighborhood. The sun was shining, and the sounds of children playing in their yards filled the air. We had no reason to suspect that anything would disrupt the tranquility we'd come to love. But just one moment, one shocking event, would change everything. Our neighbor, Karen, someone we had always considered a friendly face, did the unthinkable. She pulled the trigger, claiming it was in self-defense, accusing my wife of threatening her with something as harmless as a garden hose. But as I stood there, helpless and watching my wife fall to the ground, I knew this was no act of self-defense. There was a much deeper and darker truth that lay beneath her words, a truth that would unravel everything we thought we knew about our lives and our community. What happened that day wasn't just an accident. It was a calculated act, one that left us questioning how well we truly knew the people around us. I'm just an ordinary man, someone who has always valued peace, family, and the quiet rhythm of suburban life. My name is James, and my wife, Sarah, and I had built a life that was comfortable, even if modest. We were one of those couples who enjoyed the simple things: morning walks, evening chats, and weekends spent gardening or cooking together. Sarah was the heart of our home. Her laughter was infectious, her kindness unshakable, and her devotion to our family unwavering. I never imagined that anything could tear apart the peaceful life we had carefully cultivated. Sarah and I had been married for 5 years, and in that time, I had come to know her better than anyone else. She was the type of person who could light up a room with her presence. Whether she was volunteering at the local shelter or helping a neighbor in need, she was always the first to offer her hand. Our love wasn't perfect. We had our disagreements, but we always worked through them. Life felt like a steady, calm river, and I was content to float along, knowing that Sarah was by my side. Then there was Karen, the woman who would later become the face of our nightmare. At first glance, she seemed like any other neighbor, a woman in her late 40s, a bit on the older side, with a demeanor that could easily be mistaken for warmth. She had lived in the house next to ours for several years, and while we weren't particularly close, we had exchanged pleasantries here and there. We knew she had a bit of a sharp tongue, but nothing that would indicate the kind of person she would eventually show herself to be. Looking back, there were small signs that we overlooked, an offhand comment here or a strange look there. Karen had always been a bit possessive of her space, and I'd noticed her glaring at us when we were outside in our yard, tending to our garden, but we thought nothing of it. People can be territorial, especially in a neighborhood where everyone's trying to maintain their little slice of peace. Still, we never expected that the tension between us and Karen would escalate to something as violent as what happened that day. We'd always thought that Karen was just a little too quick to complain, but we never saw her as a threat. I remember once, Sarah had left the garden hose out on the driveway after watering the plants. It was nothing more than a small inconvenience. But Karen's reaction was something else. She had come over, demanding that we move it, claiming it was blocking her view. Sarah, ever patient, apologized and moved the hose. We thought that would be the end of it, but from that moment on, things started to shift. We began to notice Karen's increasing hostility, the way she would glare at us when we were outside. There was something in her eyes, a coldness that didn't match the pleasant smile she tried to put on. It wasn't long before small irritations turned into open conflict. Karen started making complaints about the most trivial things: the sound of our lawnmower, the flowers we planted too close to the fence, even the way we parked our car. But we brushed it off. After all, who hasn't had a difficult neighbor from time to time? We had no idea that all this was building up to something far more dangerous. Little did we know, Karen's grievances were festering inside her, becoming more twisted with each passing day. And when that final fateful moment came, it felt like everything that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over in an instant, leaving destruction in its wake. But as much as I tried to understand why Karen did what she did, the truth is, there's no explaining away what happened. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that the woman who shot my wife wasn't the Karen I thought I knew. She was someone entirely different, someone capable of unimaginable cruelty, someone who had carefully concealed her darkness behind a facade of normalcy. The woman who claimed my wife had threatened her with a garden hose would forever be etched in our lives as the one who nearly took everything from us. And the story I'm about to tell is one of betrayal, violence, and the painful truth about the people we trust. The days leading up to the incident were filled with subtle changes, shifts that should have alerted us to the danger, but at the time, they seemed insignificant. The tension between Karen and us wasn't immediately obvious. It crept in like the slow, unwelcome arrival of a storm cloud. The complaints became more frequent, the tone more biting. What started as a minor inconvenience, like the hose incident, grew into a series of disputes that stretched over weeks. I could feel the weight of it in the air every time we crossed paths with her. Sarah, ever the peacekeeper, tried to be understanding. She always made sure to apologize whenever Karen raised an issue, even if it was trivial. She'd move the garden hose, trim the flowers a little more, or adjust the car's position in the driveway just to keep the peace. But no matter what we did, Karen's dissatisfaction seemed to deepen. It became clear that no amount of compromise would be enough. I started to wonder if Karen was looking for a reason to lash out, to make a bigger issue out of nothing. It wasn't just the garden-related complaints anymore. Karen's anger seemed to fester in every interaction. One afternoon, as I was coming home from work, I saw her standing at the end of the driveway, glaring at Sarah, who was in the yard, watering the plants. The way Karen stood there, hands on her hips, her face twisted into an expression of judgment, it struck me as off. But I dismissed it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. As time passed, Karen's behavior became more unpredictable. She would pop by unannounced, her words sharp and accusatory. It felt like she was looking for a reason to escalate things, waiting for the smallest thing to set her off. I remember one incident clearly. We had a family barbecue, and as we were cleaning up, Karen stormed over, complaining that the smell of our food was drifting into her yard. I was stunned. We had always kept to ourselves, and yet here she was making an issue out of something that was, frankly, ridiculous. Sarah tried to diffuse the situation with her usual kindness, but Karen wasn't having it. Her words were cold, her eyes full of disdain. And in that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. I could feel my frustration growing. I had always prided myself on being the type of person who stayed calm and handled problems rationally, but Karen was testing my limits. It wasn't just her complaints anymore, it was the way she carried herself, as if we owed her something, as if we were constantly failing her in some way. I tried to talk to Sarah about it, to tell her that we couldn't keep bending over backward for Karen, but Sarah, ever optimistic, refused to believe that things were getting so bad. "She's just having a rough time," she'd say. "We can't let her get to us." But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel the tension building, like the quiet before a storm. And yet we continued with our daily lives, thinking that things would settle down, that the conflict would eventually fade. But I should have known better. The calm before the storm doesn't last forever. It was just a few days before the incident that I realized how far things had gone. I was in the yard, fixing the fence when Karen marched over, her face contorted in anger. She was furious about something, her voice shaking with emotion. At first, I didn't understand what she was saying. She was yelling about a neighbor's tree, about our car, about everything and nothing all at once. The words blurred together, but the aggression behind them was unmistakable. As she stormed off, I turned to Sarah and said, "This can't go on. Something's going to happen." But Sarah, as always, remained calm. She smiled at me and said, "Don't worry. She'll calm down. People like Karen, they don't stay angry forever." How wrong we were. The tension had been building for so long that when the actual incident occurred, it felt almost inevitable. That fateful day arrived like any other, but beneath the surface, the atmosphere was thick with unresolved anger. We went about our business, thinking it was just another day in our little corner of the world. But Karen, for whatever reason, had decided that this was the day she would take things to the next level. This wasn't just a neighborly squabble anymore. What happened next would change our lives forever. And just like that, in the blink of an eye, everything we thought we knew was shattered. The day everything changed started like any other, with Sarah tending to her garden in the front yard, her favorite place in the world. The sun was warm, and the scent of freshly bloomed flowers filled the air. We had no idea that what seemed like an ordinary afternoon would spiral into chaos. It all began when Sarah, as usual, was watering the plants with the garden hose. She didn't think twice about leaving it in the driveway, as she always did. But Karen, as always, had been watching from her window, and this time, she wasn't about to let it slide. She stormed out of her house, marching over to us with a look of fury on her face. I saw her coming, and for a split second, I thought this was just another complaint about the garden hose being in her way. But the way she walked, her fists clenched, and her face twisted with anger told me this was different. "I've had enough of this," Karen shouted as soon as she reached the end of our driveway. "You think you can just leave this mess here blocking my view? You don't respect anyone around here." Her voice was shrill, and the veins in her neck were taut with rage. Sarah, ever the peacekeeper, calmly turned off the hose and walked over to her. "I'm sorry, Karen. I'll move it right away. It's just the hose. No need to get upset," Sarah said softly, trying to defuse the situation. But Karen wasn't having it. She continued to shout, her words laced with venom. "You've been doing this for weeks now. Every single time you put that stupid hose here, you're just disrespecting me. I'm sick of it." Sarah stood there, stunned for a moment, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to escalate things. She never did. But I knew she was starting to feel the frustration too. This wasn't about a hose anymore. This was something deeper, something much more troubling. But Sarah, as always, did her best to stay calm. "Karen, we're just trying to live here like everyone else," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice even. "I'll move it now, okay?" But Karen wasn't listening. Her eyes narrowed as she took a step forward, her chest heaving with anger. "You think I'm some kind of fool? You think you can just brush me off like this?" Her voice was shaking, but not with fear. No, it was shaking with something far more dangerous, pure rage. Before Sarah could respond, Karen did something none of us saw coming. Without warning, she reached into her jacket, pulling out a small handgun that I didn't even know she owned. The world slowed down. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Everything that had been happening, the complaints, the tension, seemed to collide in that one moment. In a single, horrific instant, Karen raised the gun. Sarah's expression went from confusion to sheer terror as she realized what was happening. "Stay away from me," Karen screamed, her hand trembling as she aimed the gun at Sarah. I shouted for Sarah to move, to get away, but it was too late. Karen fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, like the sharp crack of thunder in a storm. Time seemed to stop as Sarah fell to the ground, her body crumpling in a way that no one should ever witness. I ran toward her, my heart in my throat. "Sarah, no!" I screamed as I dropped to my knees beside her, feeling for a pulse that barely registered. The blood was already pooling around her head, a stark contrast against the grass. My mind raced, but I couldn't process what had just happened. Karen stood there, her gun still aimed in our direction, but now her face was different. It was no longer filled with rage. It was a mask of something darker, more chilling. Regret, maybe, or guilt. But there was no time to understand her emotions. There was only time to act. I could hear sirens in the distance, but it felt like they were miles away. My whole body shook with panic and disbelief, but I knew I had to get Sarah help. I screamed for someone to call an ambulance, but I didn't know if it would make a difference. I didn't know if I'd lose my wife that day, not in the way she deserved to go. As I cradled her in my arms, I couldn't help but wonder what had driven Karen to this point. Why had she done it? Why had she taken everything we held dear and shattered it in one moment of madness? But there was no time for questions now. Only survival. Only the hope that Sarah could hold on long enough to get the help she needed. The world around me blurred into noise, but all I could focus on was her life, her breath, and the terrible silence that had come from the gunshot that changed everything. It wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. It was an attack. It was a betrayal. And as the sirens grew louder, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The moments after the gunshot felt like an eternity. The world around me was spinning, and all I could focus on was Sarah, lying motionless in my arms, blood soaking through my shirt. The sirens were growing louder, but they felt so distant, as though they were coming from another world. The shock of what had just happened made it hard to breathe, let alone think. I could barely process the reality of what had unfolded in front of me. By the time the paramedics arrived, I was numb. They rushed to Sarah's side, working quickly to stabilize her. But it was clear from the way they moved, the urgency in their voices, that this was serious. They didn't say it, but I could see it in their eyes. My wife's life was hanging by a thread. They loaded her into the ambulance, and I barely registered the world around me as I followed, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. The police arrived shortly after, and I was immediately separated from the scene. They asked questions, but my answers were fractured, barely coherent. How could I explain something so senseless? How could I articulate the horror I had just witnessed? Every question they asked felt like another weight on my chest, but I knew they had to ask. This wasn't just a simple accident, it was an attack. And Karen, the woman who had lived just a few houses down from us, was the one responsible. I didn't see Karen immediately after the incident. The police had taken her in for questioning, and all I could do was wait. I wanted answers. I wanted to know why. Why had she done this? What had pushed her to the edge to the point of shooting my wife in cold blood? But no matter how many questions ran through my mind, I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know where to begin. The investigation dragged on for days. Every time I tried to move forward, it felt like I was sinking deeper into a pit of confusion. The police reported that Karen had claimed self-defense. She said that Sarah had threatened her with a garden hose, a claim that was as absurd as it was unfounded. But in a moment of absolute terror, she had fired the gun. That was her story, the same story she had given to the police. I didn't buy it. None of it made sense. Sarah, my kind, gentle wife, was never the type to threaten anyone, let alone with a garden hose. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like a desperate attempt to justify what she had done, to make her actions seem somehow reasonable. But nothing would make what she had done right. Nothing could erase the memory of that shot, the way my wife had crumpled to the ground, her life in the balance. As Sarah lay unconscious in the hospital, I spent my days questioning the investigation. I spoke to the police, giving them every detail I could remember, every interaction we had with Karen leading up to that day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the investigation was moving too slowly, that the truth was slipping through our fingers. I wanted justice, not just for Sarah, but for the community that had been torn apart by one woman's violent act. Karen was eventually arrested, and the legal proceedings began. But the deeper I dug into the details, the more I realized just how far Karen had gone to manipulate the situation. She had told the police that Sarah had been the aggressor, that my wife had stepped toward her with the hose as if to strike her. Yet there were witnesses, neighbors who had seen the confrontation unfold. They knew the truth. Sarah had never posed a threat. She had been trying to de-escalate the situation, trying to make peace as she always did. But Karen's story stuck. It was her word against mine, and the evidence wasn't enough to immediately clear up the confusion. The police had to conduct a full investigation, and it would take time. In the meantime, I watched as my wife lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that monitored her every breath. It felt like we were living in a nightmare, waiting for answers, waiting for justice, but unsure of how long we would have to endure the uncertainty. And then the media got involved. News outlets caught wind of the story, and soon our quiet neighborhood was flooded with reporters. Headlines flashed across the screen: HOA Karen shoots neighbor over garden hose dispute. It felt surreal to see our personal tragedy splashed across the news. The media frenzy didn't help. It only intensified the pressure. Everyone had an opinion, but no one truly understood what had happened behind closed doors. But the one thing I did know, the one thing I held on to, was this: Karen's actions were not a result of self-defense. She had made a choice driven by something far deeper than a simple neighborhood disagreement. She had taken my wife's life into her hands and almost destroyed everything we had. Now, it was up to me to ensure that she didn't get away with it, that the truth came to light, and that justice was served for Sarah. As the investigation continued, I clung to the hope that one day Karen would be held accountable for what she had done. But every passing day felt like a test of my patience and strength. And as I sat beside Sarah's hospital bed, watching her fight for her life, I knew the hardest part was yet to come. The investigation stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but as the weeks passed, pieces of the truth began to fall into place. Karen's version of events, her claim of self-defense, slowly unraveled under the weight of the evidence. Neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation came forward with their statements, confirming what I had known all along. Sarah had never threatened her. Karen had fabricated the entire story, twisting the truth to suit her own narrative. But even with this new evidence, the legal battle was far from over. Karen's defense attorneys worked tirelessly to paint her as the victim, to convince the court that she had acted out of fear, out of a need to protect herself from a neighbor she claimed had turned violent. The courtroom was filled with tension, and I could feel the weight of each word, each argument. It was a fight for justice for Sarah's life, but it also felt like a fight for something more: the truth. I spent every moment by Sarah's side as she recovered, holding her hand through the long days in the hospital, never leaving her alone. It was the only thing I could do to show her I was there, that I hadn't given up on her. She was strong, stronger than I could ever have imagined. Her recovery was a long road, but with each passing day, she got a little stronger. In the courtroom, the truth finally began to shine through. The prosecution presented the facts: how Karen had lied about the garden hose incident, how she had escalated a minor disagreement into a life-threatening situation. But the most damning evidence came from the footage. Security cameras from our neighborhood captured the entire exchange, showing Karen pulling the gun without provocation, aiming it at Sarah and firing. There was no question now. Karen had acted out of anger, not fear. The moment the jury returned with their verdict, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, anger. But most of all, I felt a sense of justice. Karen was convicted of attempted murder, and the sentence would ensure she wouldn't harm anyone else again. For the first time since the shooting, I felt like we had a chance at moving forward, at healing from the nightmare she had created. But even as justice was served, it didn't erase the pain, the trauma. Sarah would always carry the scars of that day, both physical and emotional. We would have to rebuild our lives, piece by piece. The nightmare wasn't over, but it had taken a crucial step toward resolution. In the weeks that followed, I watched as Sarah found the strength to start living again. She returned to the things she loved: gardening, volunteering, spending time with the people who cared about her. The road to recovery wasn't easy, but it was possible. And through it all, she never lost her kindness, her compassion, even after everything she had been through. For me, the journey wasn't just about holding Karen accountable. It was about learning how to heal, how to rebuild what had been broken. And as we stood together in the light of justice, I knew that no matter what came next, we had each other. That was all that mattered now. The memories of that day, the terror, the gunshot, the uncertainty, those would stay with us. But they would not define us. We would move forward, stronger and more resilient than ever before. And no matter what the future held, I would never stop fighting for what was right for Sarah, for our life, and for the justice we had earned. As our journey toward healing continues, I want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced something that changed your life in an instant? Have you ever had to fight for justice? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. This is the HOA Stories, where we uncover the truth no matter how dark it may be.